Well, thank you for joining us today. It's been a while since we've done some recordings, though if you're watching these in sequence you would probably not be aware of that. But I'm back again and good to be with you. And we're reading in Galatians chapter 6, and I want to read verse 3 with you today. It says this: "For if a man think himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself." Now you need to read this in the general run of the passage, in the context, and if you listen to the previous videos on this, hopefully you will get a little background as to really what's going on. And the ideas that are being promoted here, that are being taught here, are really our responsibility when handling difficult situations, and how we manage our own behaviour and how we react to other people's behaviour when sin comes into someone's life. So I'm not going back over verses 1 and 2 again, but that's essentially what that's about. And it's about men and people that are in touch with God, people who are seeking to live their lives to please the Lord. And yet there is a warning that is brought to us here. And that is, when you're handling someone who has got into difficulties and they've sinned and they've made mistakes, we did learn in 2 videos ago in verse 1 that we need to be aware in case we too could be tempted to make the same mistake. And then we're reminded in verse 2 that we have to carry each other's burdens, that we have to fulfill the law of Christ, which James tells us is the perfect law of liberty, which is the love and the care that we have one for another. And so in this context, Paul writes in verse 3, "If any man think himself to be something, when he is nothing, he deceives himself." And this reminds us of the vital need for us to be aware that we are really nothing when it comes to our standing. Or should I put it another way? Our standing is impressive. We're forgiven. We're children of God. We're sons of God. We're in the family of God. We're blessed by grace. And that this whole epistle, I'll get the right one, Galatians, is really reminding us that we've been brought by grace into a position that was nothing to do with us. It was the grace of God. It was the kindness of God. It was the mercy of God. So we've not to think of ourselves more highly than we ought to think, to use the words of Philippians chapter 2. We've not to get too bound up or too focused on ourselves, because anything we have and any blessings we have and any good things we enjoy are because of the grace of God towards us. So he's saying to these believers, if anyone thinks himself to be something when in fact he is nothing, he deceives himself. And in fact, we will get a few more verses on. We're reminded that deception is a very dangerous thing. And deception in terms of how we think about God is a very dangerous thing. And deceiving ourselves about how we think about ourselves. And so let me read you the words of Romans chapter 12, because they kind of help me on this one. It says in Romans 12 verse 3, "I say through the grace given unto me," Paul is writing again, "to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, according as God has dealt to every man the measure of faith." So this verse is effectively saying to the believer, be humble. Verse 1 might be saying, be kind, be courteous, be a burden bearer, verse 2. Be concerned about others and restore them in verse 1. Be conscious of how you handle things. But this verse is telling us, be humble. Don't think about yourself more highly than you ought to think, but think soberly, according as God has dealt to every man the measure of faith. God has given you all a gift, an ability, a capacity to use it. It's through grace, but don't overstep the mark. Don't think of yourself more highly than you ought to think. Then another verse, just as I conclude our thoughts on verse number 3. Peter writes this in 1 Peter 5. "Likewise, you younger, submit yourselves unto the elder. Yes, all of you be subject one to another, and be clothed with humility. Talks about humility as something you put on. It's not natural to you in one sense. But you've been clothed in righteousness through the grace of God. Now you've to be clothed in humility, because God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble. And we've to humble ourselves therefore under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you. So humility is taking your place, not to be downtrodden, but to know the hand of God in lifting you up and bringing you into blessing. And that you cast your care upon him, and that you're aware of the adversary, and that you are humbly walking with God. This is what the Lord requires of you: to love mercy, to do justly, to walk humbly before your God. A great bit of advice. So verse 3 is be humble. Come back and listen to the next few verses, because we're going to be reminded that we have to be responsible. But more of that in the next video. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.